Daniel Crawford. I am the host of this show, Inequality Chronicles. Tonight's topics is the middle, the new bottom, grandpa burger flippers, college pork, caught between a rock and an empty space. Story number 1. Is the middle the new bottom? The article's title is America's middle class poorer than you think. The source is CNN Money. The author is Tammy Luby. The date was June 13th. The bullet points. Contrary to the image that having an average wealth of $301,000 per adult portrays, that seemingly amazing statistic is overshadowed by our ranking at 19th place in median wealth at a measly $44,900 per adult, which places us below Japan and Canada and the most advanced countries in Europe. In reality, the average wealth number is inflated because of two key factors: our share of the world's wealthiest inhabitants, as well as our leadership in wealth inequality. Europe outranks us in home ownership, and Australia is on top of the world in terms of median wealth at $219,500, and with respect to the distribution of wealth. Americans having to invest so much in basics, such as healthcare and higher education, contrary to what is seen in the countries doing better than us on these measurements, isn't helping our cause any. You hear a lot of bragging, talking about how we are the wealthiest country in the world. But one has to ask, what is the measurement of wealth? Of a country's wealth? Is it just based on how much is accumulated overall in aggregate? Or should it be measured based upon the flow of that wealth throughout an economy to ensure that it is sustaining itself, that it's healthy? If we are to determine a nation's true wealth based on the latter as opposed to the former, then it really must be said that the United States is not the wealthiest country in the world. Sorry. So, given those facts about the nation's well-being, you have to assess the United States' health and compare it with that of the rest of the developed world. And when you weigh the two, or any combination of any two countries, if the United States is on one end of that equation, or one end of that measurement, it's not so clear that we would come out on top. We have this terrible knack in this country thinking about things in short term. And we really do ourselves a great bit of harm in doing so. We may be, because of that measurement of average wealth, the wealthiest country on earth. But the fact that that money, that wealth only communicates a dollar amount as opposed to how those dollars are being spread around that society, or our society, it doesn't tell the bigger story at issue here. In a lot of ways, the inability for a society to have a healthy flow of its income, or rather a proper distribution of wealth, it's a lot like having a river where You have the main part of the river, and then it breaks off into streams, or vice versa. But it's like having a river that at one point tapers off and breaks off in like 2 or 3 different directions, and then reconverges. If one of those areas where that flow goes off towards, if it starts to collect more and more water over time, and say this is the part of where the most amount of water breaks off, assume that it just keeps collecting into a pool and only allows a trickle of that water to continue on downstream and then reconvene with the other 2 or other stream. What you would see in that scenario is that on the opposite end, on the other end of that river, after the streams have all broken apart and then come back together, the other part of that would see a much smaller flow. And assume that this keeps going, they keep breaking apart and coming together, and that one bigger part always keeps collecting more and more, only allowing it to trickle. Eventually, the flow runs dry. That's a really long analogy to make my point here, but it should get the brain working there and thinking about what we're doing, what we are allowing to happen. When you consider these measurements of like home ownership and how we're falling behind in that, how all these other countries are not allowing their citizens to shoulder so much of the burden of basics, like it says, such as healthcare and higher education. In these other societies, it's viewed as being, I guess, natural in a way for the collective overall to take, that burden off of the individual. Call it socialism, whatever. The reality is that it seems to be a healthier model. Some of these countries weathered the economic storm of 2008 much better than we did. Sure, we've come out a little bit stronger now, but that was only after we started doing things, that where we had to come together and try to lift our economy up. Because if we had done things a pure market way, could very well be in another Great Depression right now. My point, obviously, is that our middle class is in danger. And if our middle class is in danger, and if the middle class continues to shrink and contribute more to a growth in the poorer class, then that threatens the well-being of our economy in the future. We've got to stop thinking in terms of things in the immediate future. We've got to think about distant. We've got to reorganize our culture here to think about things beyond what we can immediately see and experience. Moving on. Story number 2. Grandpa Burger Flippers. Who actually earns the minimum wage? The source is CBS News. The author is Amy Pickey. Once again, I hope I'm not pronouncing her name wrong. And the date was June 11th. Bullet points. The Center for Economic and Policy Research has found that only 10% of those who would benefit from an increase in the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour are teenagers, compared to 25% in 1979, and that another 37% are between 35 and 64 years old. Raising the minimum wage to that level would boost the pay of 25 million workers. A majority of the minimum wage workforce are women, though that majority has been significantly reduced since 1979. The number of workers making the baseline federal minimum wage quintupled after the Great Recession. Excuse me. As this show progresses, this episode, you will notice a theme that I was trying to connect with this entire episode here. Previous story obviously talked about the diminishing power and clout of our minimum wage, not minimum wage, of our middle class in the world. The minimum wage standard was supposed to just set a floor. And there was a time when very few employers, had to be told that there was a minimum. And it was hard fought for by organized labor and many liberals in the past. This standard was. But it served that purpose to help people at the very bottom. Especially during our great prosperity period, in the immediate aftermath of World War II and the first 2 decades after that. The minimum wage standard was more for people who were just entering the workforce, or for, unfortunately, women employees. Although they should have always been considered part of the living wage bracket. But seeing how the living wage jobs are increasingly disappearing, the minimum wage standard is really our last best hope to try and revive our economy. By all means, the minimum wage standard is in need of overhaul. Significant overhaul. Seeing how the share of those on minimum wage who are actually people with families or people nearing retirement, seeing those statistics, that those numbers are growing, like I said, it quintupled, multiplied by 5 times since the Great Recession. Seeing those numbers, we have to do something to lift them up. And these are people who are dependent on these jobs as their only source of income because it's all that they had that was available. I mean, no doubt they would have gone for a living wage job if it was available, but that's not what was in the cards. Simply put, if we want our economy to be robust, to boom again, people have to have disposable income. If we want our minimum wage to reverse course and start to grow again, we have to start out with a living wage. And the way we're going to have to achieve a living wage apparently is by raising the minimum wage up to that standard. Otherwise, we're going to have to settle for substandard at best, for our economy. And we're going to have to settle for being a declining power in the world, economically, politically, and eventually even militarily. Because you know what? To support a military, you need a tax base. And with the middle class shrinking, and with the wealthiest few paying less and less, you're not going to be able to support that great military that we have for much longer. It's just not going to happen. So, give people power by lifting them up. And the benefits will come back tenfold, maybe even more than that. So, there we are. And, oh, by the way, I mentioned women briefly, and I wanted to point out that women are a majority of the minimum wage workforce because this speaks to the whole inequality issue with respect to pay gap. Raising minimum wage helps deal with that significantly. I mean, this includes a lot of single mothers Think about that. If you raise a minimum wage and create a living wage, you give those single mothers and their children a fighting chance, which is only good for society in the end. It just is. No doubt over time we'll talk about the minimum wage more and more. Story number 3. College pork. The article's title: If colleges didn't waste your tuition, we wouldn't need student loan reform. We wouldn't need new student loan reform, excuse me. The source is The Guardian. The author is Michelle Chen. And the date was June 11th. Bullet points. Tuition cost has more than doubled since the early 1980s. The increase in tuition has mostly been driven by luxury expenditures such as the construction of sports arenas, not by the quality of instruction. Private colleges have been increasingly financialized, and the public colleges are taking on a more service industry style approach, and have presided over a doubling of costs in the past 20 years. In the meantime, the Pell Grant is covering less and less of this cost. Again, pardon me, it's like 90 degrees in here. Anyway. Our middle class, the minimum wage, and this right here, education. This is part of how we could rebuild the middle class, strengthen our economy, strengthen our standing in the world. It's by focusing on higher education. And you saw it in the example in the minimum wage article. These families who are trying to give their kids a better life than what they had are being crushed under this burden that they have to take on more and more on their own. And it is in a way becoming a disincentive for reaching higher. It is becoming a disincentive, a literal disincentive for trying to provide a better life for yourself. We are disincentivizing the future of our middle class. If there is no social ladder, if there is a debt sentence, as you've heard many refer to it, then why should any person who's around the poverty line, just barely in it, or within the middle class, even strive to go for an education? I mean, the fact that the Pell Grant has not been updated to keep up with the rate of inflation. I mean, not just as far as the tuition rates are concerned, but even just inflation overall. If it isn't being pegged to that, and it's actually covering less and less over time, it's losing its value. All you're saying is, you know what? Society is not going to invest in you. We're not going to invest in our middle class's future or in America's future standing in the world. We're putting it on you. You have to take care of yourself. To hell with you. If you want an education, fine. You're on your own. That's what we are increasingly saying. This hits close to home for me because I recently graduated from college. I have a debt. Of course, I'm in the unfortunate position to be so poor that my debt is being serviced for me. And I'm thankful that exists in our society, but I don't take pride in the fact that I'm too poor to even service it myself. I would much rather service the debt on my own. I would much rather be able to afford to do so. But we have this burden that we have slapped onto society, on the middle class and those who are just right at the poverty line, or the in-betweens, who you'll hear about in the next story. We are shackling our progress, holding ourselves back. I mean, we're turning college into yet another area where the financial industry can You just get easy money. That's more or less what it is. You go out there and you promote these dreams that people can reach for. Tell them you can reach for the stars. You can, accomplish your dreams. Just take out a loan, and another, and another. And after you've exhausted all your public loans, go for a private loan. Indebt yourself to another institution. Because your Pell Grant sure isn't going to be there for you entirely. You're going to exhaust it quickly. It is a crime to continue in this pattern. And it's pitiful. We need to care more about our future as a society. Otherwise, what are we telling future generations? At the very least, we need to invest in education, and at all levels. It is my honest opinion that higher education should be public funded, purely. Just as, elementary school and high school, middle school are. Should be public funded. Because society needs to care about the education of its citizenry. Because without education, you don't have the basis for a prosperous economy, nor do you have the basis, a stable basis for a functional democracy. You just don't. Final story. Story number 4. Caught between a rock and an empty space. In Between in California is the article's title. Source is Al Jazeera America. Ooh. The authors are E. Tammy Kim and Lam Thuy Vo. I hope I pronounced that right. I am so sorry if I didn't. And the date of its publishing was June 11th. The bullet points. The working poor now represent 32% of America. And many of America's worst off citizens are those who fall between the official yet outdated federal poverty line and the accepted standard for self-sufficiency. Most Americans spend more money on housing expenses than what is considered affordable. Transportation costs are considered to be the second largest expense for U.S. households, and it presents a problem primarily because it discourages many from even bothering with a vehicle, which can hinder one's job search on top of numerous other concerns. About 7% of our income is spent on health care, and debt in this area is the leading cause of bankruptcy. There was another part of this story that I overlooked because I talked about it in a previous episode of this show, and that was the cost of food. Now, it's been mentioned that how much money we Americans spend on food has actually decreased over time. But that doesn't mean that food's getting cheaper. It just doesn't. In a way, it leaves you with this false impression that, oh, yeah, people are feeling more comfortable with how they're spending their money on food, so they can free it up for other things. But that's just not the case. The reality is, number one, as mentioned in that previous story that I mentioned in the prior episode, people are buying cheaper food that is unhealthy. Processed food. We need to do something about the cost of food in general to help bring it down, but we need to recognize that this is a problem. People having to buy food that's unhealthy for them, therefore contributing to another one of these expenses, the healthcare crisis. The other thing, the other reason why the share of our budget that is devoted to food is going down is because these other costs are going up. Housing, healthcare, transportation. They're eating up more and more of our budgets over time. That's not a good thing. What you want for people to be able to do is to be able to have to spend less on transportation, less on housing, less on healthcare, and even less on food over time. Not because they're doing things improperly, but because the prices have gone down or they have more money available to them. Therefore, you want to free up more income. Disposable income. Because that's what's essential for an economy to work, is disposable income. You need plenty of money left over after you pay for all the essentials to be able to waste it on things that you don't need. That's how a consumer-based economy has worked. That's how a consumer-based economy works. I mean, not just that, just to get the economic gears going, also about the ability just to enjoy life. You need to be able to treat yourself every now and then. I rail from time to time on social media against all the distractions in society from our problems, but it kind of is a little important for people to be able to have entertainment and stuff every now and then, for us to be able to enjoy life from time to time rather than constantly bitching about everything, because if we don't, eventually all we have is anger, and that doesn't lead to very good things. Eventually we do need to get angry about a lot of these things, but this right here, talk about the in-betweens. These are people who aren't poor enough to get whatever assistance they need, and they don't make enough money to survive on their own, so they're just stuck, and life's getting worse for them. And this is it's kind of another class in and of itself. They're considered the working poor to a degree, but they're like too poor to be middle class. But this is where more and more Americans are heading towards, this in-between stage. And we need to fill this loophole in our society, our economic loophole. Otherwise, we're damning ourselves to another lost decade, sort of like what Japan went through. Alright, to recap. While our collective wealth is the envy of the world, the imbalance in how said wealth is spread out across the population is dismal. And that is why the United States is far behind Australia and Western Europe in terms of the world's wealthiest middle classes. Despite the relentless attempts by minimum wage detractors to claim that teenage workers comprise the bulk of those making such, only 1 in every 10 low-wage employees are teens. Higher education is becoming more essential to make a living, while it is also becoming more expensive, for all the wrong reasons. Thanks to a combination of factors, including stagnating wages, rising costs, and outdated poverty standards, more and more of our countrymen are falling through the proverbial cracks. Excuse me. Alright. You see, I don't have to say it again, as I have all this time, that there's something wrong with our society. Actually, there's something wrong with the global economy. We are the leaders of it, after all. I mean, we like to take pride in that from time to time, but there's also some shame that comes with it. Because if we fail to address these issues, that sends the wrong message to the rest of the world. We have to stop condoning this. We have to stop tolerating it as if it's become the new norm. Inequality leads to destabilization. And that's not the path you want the world to take. That's not the path you want humanity to take. We are so much better than this. We, as humans, overall, not just as Americans, but as humans, we can accomplish so many more things if we just came together and worked tirelessly to address these issues. This can be done. This can be rectified. So with that, I'll close. Keep in mind all these stories. I'm sorry for the brief interruption. I had to address something and I had to pause it briefly. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.